Welcome to Rebel Spirit Radio, exploring the frontiers of spirituality, consciousness, the esoteric, and humanity's sacred relationship with the living earth. I'm your host, Nick Mather, and in this episode I speak with Dr. Alex Brezinski, founder of the Continua Work. Alex discusses the participatory spiritual cosmology he wrote about in his doctoral dissertation titled Ecologies of the Soul. He talks about working with non-physical intelligences and the energies of the earth, what Alex calls the allies. He also speaks on transpersonal psychology, embodied spirituality, maneuvering through uncertainty, activating virtues, psychedelics, and the development of his Continua Work. Dr. Alex Brezinski holds an MA in philosophy, cosmology, and consciousness and a PhD in East-West psychology from the California Institute of Integral Studies. Alex's work at CIS allowed him to explore psychedelics, Buddhist cosmology, shamanic practices, embodied meditation, archetypal theory, and ecological thinking. His dissertation, Ecologies of the Soul, an inquiry into the relationships between the collective human psyche and non-physical entities, explored non-physical entities encountered in non-ordinary states of consciousness, out of which he constructed a theoretical model of a non-physical matrix that he refers to as alliance. He has lived and studied in China, Japan, Tibet, and the Philippines. He is the founder of the Continua Work and Embodied Sky Massage Therapy. Alex, welcome to Rebel Spirit Radio.
Thanks, Nick. Great to be here.
Yes, I'm looking forward to this conversation. It's going to be, I think, a bit different than some of the other interviews I've done before. And so I'm looking forward to the challenge, and I'm looking forward to digging into this material. It's quite fascinating, I think. So I thought the best place to start, and I'm not sure, there were several places I thought that we could start with, but I thought maybe the best place to start was to have you discuss the title of your dissertation, Ecologies of Soul. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, it went through, the dissertation went through a few different working titles, as as they always do for everyone. And that was sort of the simplest title. And we were talking about this just recently over email, and when I thought about it, I'm like, that was actually a really good title, because it encompasses the ecologies part and the soul part. So just a simple sort of interplay there is the worldly dimension, that we live in this world where there are these beings, powers, energies, intelligences. So I was interested in all of that ecological, the relational value, the kind of biological. When we talk about ecological, I often think of it like these are biological. But then on the other hand, we have the soul dimension, that this is what I'm talking about in the dissertation, and what people talk about often when they're talking about more internal states, right? Like the meditative state. And also conceptually, there was this big piece that really came through on the way that we incarnate into the world. So when we think about, who am I in this world? Where did I come from? And maybe what is my purpose in this world? What is there outside of me that is sort of propelling me through? We might think of it as destiny, as fate, as my inner guide, my personal dharma, these sort of things. And so that incarnational piece came through. So naturally I was like, well, if it's incarnation, I have to sort of think about what is this idea of a soul. So that's sort of what I'm looking at. It's also, there's sort of, what I'm constantly doing with this work is I find like it's constantly kind of a rebuttal or reframing or revisioning of all of the esoteric or religious or spiritual practices that we're more familiar with. There's these top-down cosmologies, these sort of privileging of the kind of interior spaces, these paradigms where the physical world is kind of just sort of an afterthought. And I'm always trying to sort of pivot and be like, no, that like this is where the action is. The physical world, the biological world, the ecological world, so that when we go towards the heart of the soul, we don't go through ecology in the way of like most transpersonal paradigms, and certainly most religious paradigms always have this idea of yeah, life exists, it's real, it has an important place to play, or important role to play. Biology is important, the body is important, but let's really get to the real reality, and sort of leave that behind. Now, imagination would be another one like that. It's kind of like, yeah, that's good. Like we need that, but we're gonna go beyond. And I wanted to be like, no, like the deeper you go, the farther you go, the more healthier, more like the greater wholeness, transpersonal sort of shtick. There's always this ecology.
You mentioned transpersonal a few times. Could you say a little bit for anyone who may not be familiar with what transpersonal psychology is?
Well, I suppose everybody has a different take. My understanding of transpersonal theory, transpersonal psychology, transpersonal studies was very much shaped by my time at the California Institute of Integral Studies, was particularly shaped by my work with my mentors, Jorge Ferrer and Christopher Beisch, and also the work of the pioneers, founders loosely of transpersonal psychology, Stanislav Grof and Ken Wilber. There were other people involved as well, but they're sort of these two big pillars. So transpersonal, the sense of a personal psychology is everything we know. It's in the brain, and the brain generates this reality that we kind of experience as consciousness, which is maybe as an afterthought of the brain. Or if we maybe get away from such a like scientific materialist perspective, we have this idea of well, that maybe there's a soul, or there's some form of consciousness. Maybe it's not like a religious consciousness, but it's me. I am the unit of that. You are the unit of your personal psychology, and that's these two consciousnesses or two psyches. Maybe they interact. Maybe they're part of a larger group, but it's sort of this sense of a bunch of units in a system. Transpersonal psychology is a different perspective. So there's this idea that we're swimming in this world of all these different powers, intelligences, and often like they're ranked. People make a lot of maps. I like to make maps. I'm a fan of maps and these sort of taxonomies. Jorge Ferrer, one of my mentors, he was in one class I was taking for him. He's like, Alex, you're always making these new charts, these new diagrams. like when is it going to end? And it never ended. It just kept going. So I like those maps, those charts. But there's this idea that there are these domains. That's sort of the most sort of general abstract term. These domains of intelligence outside of human intelligence, domains of psyche outside of the human psyche, but also outside of the individual psyche. Often the senses were anchored in this deeper ground of being, which already that's kind of a contested term in certain ways, but we're anchored in this deeper matrix, and everybody has a different take on what that is. But it's particularly important, I think. It's an antidote to nihilism, right? An antidote to some of the more cynical impulses in our society, and it's an antidote to some of these, some of our ways that are some blind spots, right? We get locked inside of our own head, and it's kind of unhealthy. And transpersonal psychology offers all this, such a rich world, and in particular, in the when I was doing work in the philosophy, cosmology, and consciousness program at CIIS, there was this sense of the enchantedness of the world, that we went through this arc in Western history and the development of the modern mind, where we distance ourselves and in some sense rejected or suppressed these magical, enchanted, wondrous, mysterious dimensions of the universe. And that the view that the modern mind holds up, it's great in so many ways, but in some ways it's dead wrong about the fact that the universe is just like, a bunch of billiard balls bouncing off of each other.
Thank you for that. I think that was very helpful. I think you've kind of have done this, and there are several things that you've said that we're going to elaborate on. But one of the questions I had, and this is what I think you've already done, is I wanted to ask you to walk me through the psychic landscape that makes up this cosmology of the soul. So could you go a little bit deeper as to what exactly this is, what's going on in the model that you're presenting?
So yeah, thanks. I love talking about this model, and it's always evolving, and I'm always emphasizing different parts of it at different times. But yeah, I think a lot about it all day, every day. So I think the ecology is really the place to start with. In contrast to most transpersonal models, psychologies, I don't really start with this sense of like the human being as the center, or alternatively maybe the physical world as the center. And it's in some ways it's a model with no center, and that's why I like the idea of ecology. There's these different niches, and there's these different beings living in these different niches, and they relate to each other. So that's sort of it right there, and we're just sort of open to that existing anywhere. So we could think of like, okay, our physical world, that's just one niche, that's just one world. Our physical world is in relationship to these other worlds, many other worlds, which we can't see because they're not physical unless we're doing certain practices or working with things like psychedelics to be able to perceive these worlds. And we can talk about, are we really perceiving them, or are we somehow co-generating them with our consciousness? That's a huge line of inquiry. But there are these other worlds. These worlds are inhabited. These worlds have intelligence embedded in them. Our world has intelligence embedded in them, and they're relating to each other. So that's sort of the landscape of now. And then I think more importantly, we can sort of look at, or equally importantly, we can look at a sort of another dimension, which is this ancestral dimension. Sometimes what I think of as karma, or following on the work of Rupert Sheldrake, the idea of the morphic field, that our actions now have this resonance that exists, and is stored, that is kept in this non-physical matrix. Some people talk about the Akashic record. It's kind of a similar idea. I love the idea of the morphic field, the idea that there's this sort of topography, trans-physical. It's physical and it's non-physical. The physical is just one element, like one little peak in this topography, or one little valley, depending on how you want to think about it. And that we're carving out these channels through this topography, generating new worlds. Worlds are coming to an end, but there's this memory, this informational matrix where this stuff is stored. And the key part, and this is something I really comes from my work with Jorge Ferrer, is that the universe, this ecology, it's participatory in nature. The human soul is participatory in nature. We participate in this greater topography, this greater matrix, this greater field, and that's absolutely significant. We have to bow to the reality that we live in. We can't be like, okay, I co-create my own reality. None of this really matters. It's all love and light. It's like, no, our actions of our the consequences of our actions resonate for a very long time. Our decisions are very important, but also there's this great sense of significance, right? Again, this antidote to nihilism is I'm not just this cog bouncing around. Maybe some older conceptions of astrology, of this just very deterministic, sort of mystical universe that we live in, archetypal universe that we live in, but we can't really do much. Well, the participatory framework is like, yes, there are these archetypal principles, but we're moving forward in them. And so the last piece I would say, going a little deeper, is that like, where do I come from? Like, I'm a human being. I have my job, I pay my taxes, I go to work, I have a family. Like how do I fit into this huge cosmic world? And so the who we are, our personal consciousness, our awakened consciousness, is part of a larger unconscious, or maybe a super conscious, a larger domain of intelligence that's sort of like my intelligence, my larger self, my higher self, my deeper self. And that is itself, it's embedded in these other powers. And where do those powers come from? Well, they pre-existed, like my personal existence, your personal existence, but they came together in this very composite way. So it's a contrast to these other cosmologies that say, well, okay, we admit there's a spiritual world. It's God, it's Brahman, it's the Tao. It emanates, and there's the individual. End of story. No, it's like there are really a lot of powers that come together, and this is where we get into this idea of integralism, or an integral inquiry, is that we're looking at these different powers and we're not privileging one. We're not trying to drill down to the very basic bedrock and figure out, okay, what is the real reality, or who is the supreme being? We're accepting that because the world is ecological, the cosmos is ecological, it originates out of this interplay of all of these powers. And that's what brings me into the world. And that's what's, moment by moment, we're generating this world together, all of us. And behind us are all of these ancestors, these allies.
Because of these allies, I just want to make sure I'm getting your terminology correct. This greater vision and the allies, don't you also refer to this sort of, I guess, theory as the alliance? Or does the alliance mean something more specific? Or
more specific, the term alliance refers to this very specific structure that reality seems to be organized around. You kind of think of it as a mandala. In a more general sense, I talk about allies, so non-physical allies, in a very sort of maybe more familiar to at least people who do spiritual work. Ally, it's like a spirit guide, right? It's an inner voice, a higher self, a deeper self, some kind of intelligence that I can help come into my experience of the world, and that will be helpful to me. Maybe give me some guidance, maybe help me do some divination to see the future. Maybe it'll participate in a healing of a client, help me heal a client. Maybe it's sort of a virtue that arises within me, or virtue that arises in a society. So these allies, the sense of these maybe magical beings in a very literal sense that I think is at times can be valid. A being that can be conjured into a room to participate in a ceremonial space to help further the health of the participants in the ceremony. But I use this term ally, I use it in such a general sense to really refer to any being that we might encounter, and even the beings that aren't so nice, aren't so helpful, that are maybe representative of sort of diseased spiritual energies. They're still potential allies. Ultimately, you work long enough, patiently enough, you can bring them in. So that's the sense of just the world is filled with allies. We need to be in contact with our allies. They are our birthright. They brought us into this world. We're we're the tip of this spear that's moving through, and the allies are propelling us, and we want to help them presence more in this world, not to erase my personal ego, but to just help my personal ego come forward, our society come forward, our relationships come forward with these very benevolent energies that we're usually not aware of, that we kind of pretend they don't exist. And then there's a sort of a very close relationship of ancestral presences. So if you sort of think about it, wait, they're what's bringing me forward into this world. That sounds like an ancestor, a deceased ancestor, or just some more general ancestral matrix. So those would also be allies. Now, this structure that I refer to as alliance, it is a certain way that energies come together. This is sort of the core of the Continua work that I teach. The universe figured out this sort of mandala, this structure of the way these energies can be integrated together, the way they bounce off of each other, the way they complement each other, the way they align with each other. And it creates this energetic pattern, this developmental pattern that we see, that I see it everywhere. That's my contention, that it's embedded into the very fabric of reality. And when we start moving in alignment with this, good things happen.
Would that be similar to synchronicity?
In what way?
Well, I was thinking in terms of synchronicity in the way of a kind of an alignment of various forces and symbols that provide guidance and meaning at a specific time. But it's sort of temporary. I mean, it is temporary. It's a temporary configuration. And when you were speaking, that's what I was thinking of, was synchronicity.
Yeah. I'm familiar with the concept of synchronicity, particularly in the work of Carl Jung, and it's a pretty trippy concept when you think about it. It's the way I think about it is just that there is pattern and meaning embedded in the universe, and the fact we're not seeing it all the time is because we're conditioned to screen it out, and that conditioning basically is a good thing because we'd be completely overwhelmed. We wouldn't be able to function. And we see this kind of in schizophrenics, right? The contention, I think, is most people who work in this world is schizophrenic people aren't deluded. They're not hallucinating. They're not creating something that isn't there. They're just there in a way that's pathological. The gate is open too wide, and they're seeing those synchronicities. They're seeing the patterns. They're seeing the larger pattern, but they can't sort of close the gate and focus. So that condition, that biological conditioning, that social conditioning, it's a good thing, but it's also used in this sort of program of disenchantment of the modern mind. It's used to sort of keep us in our little box, keep us domesticated. We don't want you seeing the larger patterns, the larger intelligences here. We want to keep you focused. So there's sort of this balance of that, and that I think is very, very core to the work I do. I'm thinking of the idea of inflation, of psychological inflation, spiritual inflation, where somebody opens to these powers. Powers come in, and the person becomes convinced that they're the prophet. They can convinced that they're embodying the Godhead. They're the Messiah, and they're convinced it's all happening right now. And they're going to tell you, this is the moment at which the new age begins, and it's all getting cleared away. And they have a straight line to that. And everybody warns against this, right? Like the dangers of becoming inflated. You tap into this stuff, and it's like, whoa, like my eyes have seen the glory, and boy, am I going to tell you about it. So that's human societies have developed ways of modulating these energies. And these techniques we have of modulating these energies, it's a very mixed bag, right? We're doing what we have to do to sort of block out the full weight of the numinous. Jung talks about this, the mediation, the way that the psyche mediates the numinous. It's got to happen. We have to be able to mediate it. But that mediating function becomes calcified and become a very oppressive tool for keeping us sort of trapped in our archonic prison.
Yeah, those damn archons. I'm always cursing the archons. And the demiurge. Let's not forget the demiurge.
Yes.
But yeah, it's I think that people who work or are open to synchronicity, one of the things that I've heard a lot is that the more you pay attention, the more you observe. And so something you had said previously also that triggered the initial question. But, I'll share this with you. Many, many years ago, this was back in the 90s sometime, I decided to try to look at the world as if everything were a symbol. And I was trying, I think, to live in that sort of matrix where I was completely open to everything. And I could only do it for about a week or so. And it was just way too overwhelming. So, I understand that the need for that filter. So let's dig in to the entities. And this is going to lead me to something else. I'm very curious about them. And I told you before we began recording that, I don't know if I want to say that I'm a skeptic, because I think that may be a little bit too harsh. I'm evidence-based, I suppose. And there's a part of me that is a bit hesitant. I know that, for example, I would consider myself a reincarnationist. I think that there's evidence for reincarnation. And if reincarnation is true, that entails that there is a non-physical something where there are some kind of entities somewhere. So, I have to admit that. I also know that there's a history of working with non-physical entities or allies. That's part of the shamanic traditions.
Right.
When I was younger, I was really taken with the channeled work of Jane Roberts, the Seth material. And I know that in the Western esoteric traditions, Aleister Crowley, his book of the law, the foundation of Thelema, was transmitted to him through an alien entity named Iwas, I think. Both Robert Anton Wilson and Philip K. Dick, authors that I admire, had some kind of communication from some non-terrestrial and I think non-physical source. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but even now, a UFO researcher, Stephen Greer, is training people on how to contact alien entities telepathically.
Yeah.
And so this is all, it's a challenge to a materialistic point of view. It's a challenge, as you said, to the cosmology that we all find ourselves sort of trapped in at the moment. So I want to ask you about these entities, and I want to ask you about your research on these non-physical entities. And I'm just going to hand it over to you.
Cool. Yeah. So I think one thing this is such a big question, right? It's such a big domain of inquiry, and it's kind of the heart of those of us who we're interested in the non-physical worlds. This is sort of the big question is okay, what are the validity of these intelligences? Like, how can we speak of them meaningfully? And okay, like, you're painting this cool picture, but how is this different from just a really cool science fiction story? Like, what is the pragmatic value? And I think it's important to really to acknowledge when we sort of step into this world, and when we talk about it in a serious way, in a way that really honors what's there, is that these entities and allies, beings, whatever we want to call them, ancestral presences, they're not like they are, we can think of them very usefully as people. Like, I'm okay calling them people. But they're not people in the way that we are people, right? This is kind of like, I kind of get this thing, like if I'm debating with like a fundamentalist or a hardcore theist, like what I come down to is like, yeah, this God being that you worship, that's talked about in your scriptures, like if we really get down to it, is it really a being in any meaningful sense of the word? If it's truly supreme, if it's truly infinite, like is it like it just sort of, it loses it just becomes meaningless to talk about it as a being or as having will. So I think that's an important thing to keep in mind with sort of all these non-physical beings, is that when we say they're intelligent, when they say they have purpose, when they say that they are people, when they say that they exist as, in some sense, as individuals, that's not in the same way as we experience it in the physical world. But that's also not just to throw in the towel and be like, okay, they just exist differently, so we can't really talk about it. Like I get a little bit, I'm not a fan of people in the response that I hear from some people when I'm talking about these things of like, well, it's ineffable. We can't talk about it. The Tao is the Tao that can't be spoken, period, end of conversation. It's like, okay, like what do I do with that? So that I think is, it's important to hold both of those, that there's the physical world that is described to us by scientific materialism, or the rather limited spiritual worlds that are described to us by spiritual cosmologies. That's not all that's going on. They describe a certain sector of reality. Some of my very conventional, Christian, devout Christian friends, there's a part, like their theology, which I mostly quite disagree with. There are parts of it that are very, I think, very useful and have real pragmatic value, is seeing something important. The scientific materialists, there's a lot to be said for that materialist, sort of incisive materialist lens. The scientific lens, very, very, I love science, in it's more what I think of as a pure state. I really like it. So these are useful, but there's more going on there. And so that's, I think, anytime we step into this sort of discussion, we have to think that to say that they're just hallucinations, to say that they're just ephemera, just like my overactive imagination, you're on drugs, you're seeing something that's not there. This is schizophrenic. Like all these things that just write it off, like that's not true. But also, and this is the problem I have with a lot of New Age material, is it's just overly literal. It's like, okay, I encountered this being. You were meditating in a non-ordinary state, or you were born with this gift to transmit, the stuff from this, Aleister Crowley's guide, or Jane Roberts' guide, Seth. Like, but then there's sort of the way it's articulated. He's like, wait, like this being sounds just like, it just sounds like the guy living down the street, but, cooler and more powerful. Neil Donald Walsh, like Conversations with God. Like, I love those books. They're so it's just such a healthy perspective. But reading them, I'm like, why does this sound like the worldview, like God's worldview is a late 20th century guy living in the Pacific Northwest? It's so clearly like God is just like the highest realization of the values of this guy in this particular culture. And we can say that, I think, with great certainty, with great emphasis, at least, that a lot of any religious tradition we look at, they're the holiest of the holy scriptures. They're like, yeah, This is so obviously a product of your culture. It might be the best that your culture has done, but it's just a product. Okay, so that's sort of a whole thing. We just have to like get out of the way. And it speaks to sort of your idea as skepticism. So I think it's right to be skeptical when people are just like, yes, they've told me, the Andromedans told me that the world's going to end in 2012. It's like, okay, like that's okay. They're from Andromeda. There's a world. It's ending. It's 2012 is when it's going to end. Okay, you're getting some important information here, but how should we really interpret that? Just like your dreams, right? Like okay, my dream. I had this very like disturbing dream. Well, how should we interpret that? Yeah. So let me just is there? Let's just sort of let me put that out, and if there's you want to launch off from any of those.
I think that's absolutely correct. And it helps me put into perspective some things. And, one of the issues, especially with what we would refer to as like channeled material, that would be like, the Jane Roberts and what Crowley did with the Book of the Law. Yeah, there's some really good ideas in there. And there's some, and I think that Crowley's book is probably the one that's probably the most out there in terms of trying to read it. Doesn't necessarily read like his Time and Place. Maybe. I have a hard time reading through a lot of Crowley stuff. One of the things I teach my students all the time is that every sacred text is a product of its place and its time. And so when we read the Hebrew Bible, we're reading the product of a Bronze Age theology, of a Bronze Age people. And it's going to reflect that. And the question, though, is, is there, were the authors of these texts, were they inspired? That's something we can't ever answer. But even if they were inspired, it still filtered through the lenses of their time and their place. I also was thinking one of my interests, and probably a little bit of an obsession, is with UFOs. And I love the contact movement, the contactees of the 1950s. And even today, you see a similar thing where the messages that they're getting refer to the particular historical situation. So back in the 50s, the contactees were all being told, end nuclear war, get rid of the bomb. And now it's all about climate and ecology and the environment. But that doesn't necessarily undermine, I don't think, the reality, because these are messages that we need to hear.
Yeah, the UFO material, I think, is the most challenging. Nick, are you familiar with Sean Hargans's work in exostudies and extraterrestrials and UFOs?
No. I will write his name down. Sean Hargans.
Yeah, he was at the California Institute of Integral Studies, and he's the founder of exostudies. And it I deeply respect his work. It just seems like he's not falling in any of the traps that people sooner or later fall into. But some of the stuff he has is very literal. It is. I mean, and he looks at the gamut of like any different dimension, any different form of inquiry. It's all there. But there is some stuff like, there's a piece of a physical material that's sitting in a vault somewhere that came from an alien spacecraft, and you can go and touch it. And that's I think a good line where I'm just like, whoa. I think, I'm open to that I'm very open to that as being a real possibility. But if you were like, yay or nay, I think I would say nay. I would say, like, I don't, that just sounds incredible. Incredible as in it doesn't sound quite believable. I'm open to it. I'm open to being disproven. But that's where, the rubber kind of hits the road when you really get into these physical things. Like, okay, can I go and touch it? Can I go and do it? Or can I get some other people and go look at this thing that's supposedly there, and we can compare notes? That's where it starts to get kind of
Yeah. But, I also think, one, I want to say that the person that I'm somewhat familiar with who studies some of these things from an academic point of view would be Jeffrey Kripal.
Okay, yeah,
And
yeah,
and I'm so grateful for him that he is opening these things up to legitimate academic scrutiny and study,
right,
because they need to be.
yeah,
There's another academic, I forget her first name. I think her last name is Polchuka,
uh-huh,
and she wrote a book, American Cosmic, which does much the same. And I also know that there is a connection. There's been a connection for a long while, recognized, between like aliens and fairy encounters,
right,
little
right,
people. I think Graham Hancock wrote about this in his book Supernatural. And with those, there are allegedly, it may not be the beam of a UFO, but possibly a crop circle or a fairy circle. And I also think about mass sightings of things, and not just mass sightings of UFOs, but mass sightings of the Virgin Mary, and Lourdes and whatnot. And there was one in the Eastern Europe, I think back in the 90s. I forget exactly where it was. One of my best friends went there. I don't think she saw anything, but a lot of people were doing this. So it seems like whatever this matrix is of multiple intelligences, it seems like it can on occasion break through not just to one individual, but many individuals.
yeah,
And is it possible that there could be a physical aspect to it?
yeah, yeah. So I was just sort of saying my more skeptical, like where I
Mhm.
finally become a skeptic,
Yeah, 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 yeah.
like, which is really like it's a very narrow domain where I become skeptical. But even that, I'm going to qualify and say I, as a good, you know, researcher, as a good person doing open inquiry, if I want to be doing quality inquiry, I have to accept the inevitability that there are things that are going to happen within my lifetime that are gonna blow my mind. There's the stuff that I'm going to be like, whoa, like really didn't think crop circles were real. I have now changed my opinion. Crop circles are a thing. Like there are beings that are going in and they're cutting the grass or laying the grass down. Like didn't didn't really think that was happening, but it is. So for example, so stuff like that will happen. I think it's really there. One thing though, when you were talking just now, that I started thinking is I feel like there's a little psychological trap that we get into in talking about this, and I've been in that trap, and I'm still kind of struggle with it a little bit, but there's this thing where we kind of exoticize these beings, right? And our mind it wants to look to the fantastical, right? It wants to look to the wondrous. It wants to look to the cool shit. Like I wanna like that's what I want to talk about. And extraterrestrials, right? For most people, like they're pretty cool. Like they're like aliens, right? We want to think about them. We want to tell stories about them. And but embedded in that, I feel like there is this kind of what I would call kind of a dissociative transcendent psychopathology, which is sort of the pathology of the dissociated mystic, where it's like I don't really care about the earth. I want to get away from the earth. The earth is dirty and disappointing and confusing. Let's go into the luminous realm, because that's where it's not dirty and disappointing and confusing. And that is I think that is significant, right? when we're doing these inquiry in these non-physical worlds, or maybe paraphysical worlds, quasi-physical worlds, we have this choice of where I direct my attention. I can direct my attention to a very high energy valence, a very deep valence, a very more this worldly valence, maybe a more receptive valence, a more projective valence, a little more yin, a little more yang, a little more embodied, a little more disembodied. We have a choice, and they're valid choices, right? And these worlds come through, and so we have an obligation to not get kind of stuck in a rut and constantly be going towards something to the exclusion of everything else. And we have these emotional needs, right? And our emotional needs condition where our awareness goes. And where our awareness goes indicates the kind of world that we see, or maybe more accurately, the kind of world that we bring forward, the kind of world that we shape, not in its entirety, but the entire world that comes forward. And we have this obligation to let the reality flow through us and to modulate our emotions, not to deny our emotions. Our emotional engagement, our passion is essential to what we reach out for. So I say this from a perspective as like a deep ecologist, or maybe an environmentalist, or is we need to be careful about spinning out into these other worlds and forgetting about the world that's here. So anytime I hear about people talking about extraterrestrials, which I'm like, yeah, there's definitely extraterrestrials in some form are definitely out there as far as I'm concerned right now. But when we start spinning out, it's like, but what's happening here? It's kind of like the idea of like Jeff Bezos and his rocket, right? It's like a lot of people are like, oh, cool, like the technology takes off, and like, wow, he broke free of gravity. And then the reaction is like, yeah, but people can't afford to like go to school, and like we don't have school lunches. Like, what's up with that? Like, maybe there's a disconnect here. So I think we do something in the spiritual community as well, right? Yes, let's break free of Earth's gravity. Let's see what's out there. I'm excited. But what's happening here? So the allies that I'm looking at, they are so embedded in human history. The last 20,000 years. I have these pretty somewhat detailed models, cartographies of what allies arose in what parts of human history, and then even the allies that originated through the human psyche, they actually come from these deeper biological matrix, these species minds, these different beings. So that's something when someone's channeling a being, and this happens. I see this, unfortunately, or I don't know if it's unfortunate, but I see this. It's a challenge how often when I'm dealing with a client, a being is speaking through them, and it's a very it's a being that doesn't love this world, doesn't love the earth, but it speaks with authority and speaks with passion, and has a very broad perspective, a very piercing sort of illumination. But it doesn't love this world. It doesn't care about, the chipmunks that are scampering around on it's like, the chipmunks, like, they're not important. Humans are what important, and even like the transhuman. So that's when you were talking about that. I think that is sort of my greatest interest in the extraterrestrial. What is that? A debate, phenomena, interest, movement, inquiry, larger line of inquiry. Is yes, I'm excited about it, but I see how quickly it seems very common that people get spun out into this stuff, and I'm like, yeah, but these birds are going extinct. Like, how are we going to deal with that?
Yeah, and it's an assumption. I mean, unless you're having a visual encounter with like a craft or an entity, a lot of especially when it gets into the telepathic sort of communication, it's an assumption that it's an alien from another planet. It could be a intelligence from here, like you say. unless they're told, yes, we're from Andromeda or Sirius, or I forget what the other big one is.
Pleiades. The
Yeah, the Pleiades. Yeah.
Don't forget the Pleiades.
Yeah, but I'm just fascinating, regardless of any of that, of the hand in hand of getting the information or the communication, and then also saying like spheres in the sky or something. But I think your point's really well taken. And one of the questions I have is, can people enter into communication with these entities? Does it require a non-ordinary state of consciousness? And I also wonder if someone can enter into communication with these entities just out of nature, because it seems to me that there may be nature entities as well.
Totally. Yeah. Like it's, for me, it's all really, really seamless. So the work I teach is the Continua Work. It's these continuums. So it's plural. There's multiple continuums, these continua, but within our relationship to them, they are continuous with our psyche. So absolutely, like yes, and it's such a strong yes. It's actually like, it's a statement about just the organization of reality, right? That it's you can walk into nature and you're just like cruising along and thinking about, oh, what am I gonna cook for dinner tonight? And oh, that was a tough conversation I had earlier. And oh, this tree is like, ooh, wow, like there's something about this tree, like, or I just had this idea, but it was like something about my relationship with this tree. So the whole idea of ordinary state of consciousness and non-ordinary state of consciousness, very valuable. Like I think about that distinction all the time, but to really think like, okay, ordinary consciousness it's all relative. It's where I am here, non-ordinary consciousness is over there. So there can be something where I'm completely blown out of my what I normally think of as my center, and I'm often, I think I'm in Andromeda. I'm seeing these galactic vistas. That's happened. I've been there. Maybe not Andromeda, but galactic vistas disclosing themselves, or deep time. Right? It's like, whoa! Like this was like millions of years ago. Like very significant events were happening. Or even farther, getting blown out of time and space. Like I'm just in a completely timeless place. But it can be a little closer in. And the thing that I say a lot, maybe I say it a little too often, is the places that are closer are not, there's nothing wrong with them. They're not lesser. They're not of lesser value. They're not of lesser realization. They're not in some sense more like, and it's not like the things that are farther out are less corrupt or more benevolent. It's the infinite and the finite. The finite is not less than the infinite, right? That's kind of something to keep in mind. So yes, psychedelics, like the classic, get me into a non-ordinary state right now. I want to see some shit. Great, yeah, wonderful. But I think it's probably, I would assume that cultures that evolved in areas where there just weren't many psychedelic plants a long time ago, everybody was shamanic. All cultures had shamans, as far as we know. But non-psychedelic shamans, I'm sure they developed ways of doing that. I think of, I don't know much about this tradition, but like the Native American traditions of North America, the way that the sage plant, is considered to be, among some people, among some tribes, to be just like that. That is the master plant. I don't know what they call it, but like that's the holiest of holies, not maybe like the peyote or something like that. And so this idea that some people now, but maybe more commonly in the past, people could just be like, okay, it's the sage. I'm getting some information. Part of the reason this question is of relevance to it, this question is really only relevant to us. It's a really good question, and it's of extreme relevance to us, because as a modern mind, we're really, relative to people before us, relative to people living outside of modern civilization today, we're so contracted into like what our ordinary state of reality is. It's very, it's very myopic, right? And not to kick the modern mind while it's down going through its death and rebirth cycle, but I may impart some tough love to the modern mind. It's like it's really myopic. It does some stuff incredibly well, but it's like, hey, like everybody else, like the non-moderns are telling us, like there's so much more out there. Like, and it's kind of like we're like hung up on, is it ordinary reality or is it not ordinary? I need to know. I feel like I'm losing control. Yeah. Speaking from personal experience.
One of the things that I wanted to ask you about is that much of what you've been saying and what I've read of yours brings to mind something very specific. And I wanted to ask you if you've explored the Western esoteric, in particular, the Western magical traditions at all.
Not really. Not really. I'm in dialogue with colleagues who are very deep into that tradition. And there are a few things that just have not resonated with me. And I think my wonderful colleagues in the Western esoteric magical traditions are like, Alex, like, hey, like here's some cool stuff we're doing. Like, are you interested? And I'm always kind of like, well, not so much. And I think it is, I'm very much a product of my culture, right? I'm very much a product of my family. Probably, important biographical element. My mother was a very directed and effective environmental activist when I was 9, 10. And that really, my brother and I were like deeply impressed. That was a big part of our experience. And so I always sort of go towards this thing of like, where is the significance of the other species? So anytime I get like, these other species, they're trying to evolve to the point to be humans. Like, oh, the humans, the wonderful enlightened beings that must be stewards of the earth. Like that, I'm just like, okay, like we gotta, like that's pathological or highly undeveloped. Like that's probably going to be problematic. Like anything that places the human above, or anything that goes totally inward. I know that in the Western esoteric tradition, there are like sexual yogas, and I imagine there's certain embodied practices, but like the lack of embodiment, the like an insufficient reverence for nature. I think that's sometimes challenging for me. And then here's the other one that's very this is very interesting, is the idea of like manifesting stuff for yourself. I'm again, on the other side of my family, my father, big long-time Buddhist practitioner, take me off to Buddhist retreats when I was like, I don't know, 15, 16. Deeply impressed me, this Buddhist ethic of like, anytime you start getting attached to something, like that's not necessarily a bad thing, but you got to be really careful about that. And working with magical forces, I mean, I have a hard enough time staying on the horse, on the best of days, start dangling some pretty objects in front of me, and I'm like, oh, it's probably game over for me. So I just really, anytime it's like, okay, like, what was that thing, the law of attraction, or the secret?
Personally, I don't like either of those. Because there's a lot of victim blaming, I think. And it is about using the cosmos as a sort of ATM, or, a catalog. But when I mentioned the Western esoteric and magical traditions, what I was really thinking of, I started exploring the history of them a couple of years ago. I knew a little bit. I do not consider myself a practitioner in any way. But one of the things I have often been very interested in is, why was there no sort of shamanism in the West.
Yeah.
Because, and even looking at this from the perspective of a scholar of religion, it's like it's almost completely absent in the Western traditions, but we know that it was everywhere, and there was a passage in a book about Muhammad when he first had this encounter with the Archangel Gabriel, that he was terrified.
Yeah.
And that he thought he might have been, I always forget, it's like a kahir or a kabir, I think it's kahir, which was a sort of shamanic figure.
Yeah.
And so I started digging in a little bit deeper. And I know that people, there are sort of shamanic aspects to the figure of Jesus. You can say that there's shamanic aspects to the prophets, perhaps.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it was there, but where I have found it was in this Western esoteric magical tradition. When you look at it, it's like, this is complete. This is just shamanism. This is people entering altered states of consciousness and intentionally coming into contact with these entities. Now, they may be doing it for a specific end, but I was thinking, you have these medieval and Renaissance grimoires, and with all these symbols, which are just mandalas. And it's about invoking these spirits for various things, the angels, archangels, demons. And then you have Edward Kelly and John Dee, in the Dee was with Queen Elizabeth I, or Crowley talks about invoking the holy guardian angel. And so my question was really based on that, because I see a kind of connection, and I know that others have included the natural world in there as well. I don't know how successful they've been in that, and these are often, I don't know where these angels and daemons and whatnot exist, if it is this transcendental other outside of human. I mean, it is extra human, I suppose, but I don't know that there's this desire to escape this world in that. It does seem to be very much embedded in this world.
Good. Yeah. You know who I'm actually thinking of when you're talking about this is John Michael Greer.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. What's your, so how does John Michael Greer fit into this for you?
I have only read a little bit of John Michael Greer. I did read a book of his a few months ago, and I don't remember all of it because I've read probably 20 books since I read that one. But he has a book on green hermeticism, which is, and I wish that I could remember more of what he said. I would need to review it to see exactly how he ties it all together. I think that probably one way, and I'm sure that he does talk about this, is with the hermetic concept of as above, so below. And I always add to that a sort of, and I think this is Jungian, but as within, so without.
So he, like, I feel like Greer is, he's completely versed in, multiple magical traditions. He's he knows his stuff inside and out. But he's also, an arc druid of this, what do they call it? Like a reconstructed order. Like he's very clear, like this order does not go back to like the Paleolithic druids or Neolithic druids. We people got together and tried to bring together this spirituality that was nature-based, drawing on all these traditions. So he has a foot in both of those worlds, and his work as a druid, I think, is top notch. I don't know how other druids would judge him, but I think he's really in both worlds. So I think it's possible, and I thank you for pointing out, like, the esotericists, they're not real. They're not about getting out of this world. I mean, that's like the flip side, right? If on one hand the pathology is like, I want to flee the world, and on the other hand, the pathology is the world is my ATM machine. Like there's this nice meeting in the middle of where if you can sort of get the best of both. Like let's not get sucked into all this, but let's have fun. Let's enjoy it. Let's love life. The thing though, like what I'm thinking, you're mentioning something else here though, and I'm thinking this in relation to the Druids and this sort of break in the Druidic traditions. Let's just assume, for the sake of conversation, and I think this could be, maybe not proven, but there a lot of evidence could be presented for this. Let's assume all cultures were shamanic at one point in time. Let's assume European cultures were shamanic at one point in time. Let's assume that the figure of the Neolithic Druid, these practitioners like thousands of years ago, that it was like a nature-based shamanism, and that there were all these cultures. It wasn't just like in the British Isles, but all these different cultures had these traditions. What I'm basically describing here is a pagan spirituality, but that word is so contested now. I don't even want to use it. But that's, in terms of I'm speaking of the historical pagan, not the spiritual pagan, which is, the spiritual pagan's there's a whole religious apparatus there. So what I feel like is there is in the Western psyche, there is a deep wound and a craziness around the European encounter with Levant spirituality, right? And side note, but just to see where you're going, like the anti-Semitic strand that is so strong in the Western psyche, but it's there in America, it's there in Europe, it's still, its pathology is still like squirting up, toxicity and karma. What I feel like this is that these beings came out of the Levant, right? And cultural streams were carrying these energies of these beings out of the Levant. And cultures accreted around these very numinous energies in ways that were, in some ways, highly problematic. The Catholic Church carrying out, inquisitions, pogroms, the Protestant Reformation spinning off of this and pulling on new allies, maybe transcendent, maybe of the earth, maybe they'd been in the pagan mind for a long time, the historical pagan. And there's this freak out, right, in the Western psyche when it's encountered by these forces of domination, right? And I think we can, at least in the first few centuries, we can assume that the pagan encounter with the Christian mind, which is kind of carrying inside of it this kernel of the Judaic mind, or Christian allies, Judaic allies, that encounter was traumatic. It was massively traumatic. People being killed, people being raped, children being taken from their families, given over to the church. Over time, there's this sort of survival mechanism where you have to incorporate. You just have to deal with it. You have to absorb the conquered. People do this all the time with modern Western culture, right? It comes into a culture and people are like, like, okay, I guess we got to become kind of modern now. This happened to, I'll say us, as historical moderns, as contemporary moderns. We're freaking out about that encounter. So I think Western esotericism has this very it's holding sort of, it's a countercultural current. Obviously, it's very countercultural. It's not like the dominator hegemonic culture, but it's absorbed some of these more Christian cosmologies, which is, obviously it's Neoplatonic as well, but it's absorbing that. And I think that's something, there's this tension that I just feel like in this conversation, there's this tension between like a more like this ancient pagan matrix, this ancient, pre-Christian matrix that has a very different way of relating to the world. And I think Western esotericism, it's like, ooh, the magic, the enchanted world, right? The enchanted world outside of strict Christian theology or Catholic theology, Protestantism being kind of this important thing there. And I think how we relate to it is important. I feel like for whatever reason, I'm more in this deeper matrix, probably for reasons of my biography, but this older sort of pre-Christian matrix, and that kind of some of the Christian cosmology, it seems a little like, ooh, like, oh, it's like something that you got to be alert to. You got to be like, it's like, okay, time to dance. This is a very serious player, and we've got to deal with that. So I think that when we choose the spirit, when we find our spiritual path, or we choose a tradition, or we generate our own tradition, there's deep emotional needs there, and deep aesthetic needs, and those are anchored in our personal biography. But certainly our personal biography comes out of this more transpersonal matrix. So I think that just fascinating, like so many different strands are coming through there and they're in the conversation. Like they're all behind us, like dancing.
Yeah. And you hit on a lot of things that are why I'm personally kind of interested in researching this. It was over the summer was the first time I really saw anyone make the claims or openly talk about the trauma of people who originated from Europe and yet lost their indigenous traditions because of Christian conquest. And I think that there is something deep within us that wants to go back to that nature-based experiences and this greater enchanted world where there are, helpful and harmful forces, right? And like I said, I've always been concerned with the, where did the shamanism go? You and I both knew the late Stephen Goodman.
Yeah.
And he told me once, I know, one of his observations to me was, you just seem very concerned with tradition all the time.
He said that to you?
Yeah. Well, and I understand that, because I think that we're kind of trained in a way to think in terms of tradition, in terms of spirituality, that a history to the spirituality seems to be important. And that's, I think, one of the reasons why the esoteric stuff is appealing to me, because it provides a pagan tradition in the true sense of the term, the old pagans, not the new, synonymous with Wicca or anything like that, but gives a avenue for entering into this very different cosmology and kind of spiritual ecology. And I love that term, spiritual ecology.
Yes. Rob Rubin, if you're listening, Rob Rubin is actually he's my primary Western esoteric interlocutor, and he hates that term when I use it.
Well, when I was writing the kind of putting together the brief bio for you, and I don't know that you had given me the title of your dissertation before. Okay. And I don't remember if you had mentioned a spiritual ecology when we spoke previously. Okay. You might have, but I was reading everything and I was going through the chapter of your dissertation you sent me and the other material. And that's what came to me. I'm like, oh, this is an ecology of soul.
Really? So you didn't get that from, you didn't actually see my dissertation title?
No, it wasn't in the chapter header. It was just chapter 7 or something.
Awesome. Yeah. So good.
Yeah. So I think that it's simpler and it gets to the heart of the matter.
Yeah. I think the reason maybe I didn't mention it is I've been dredging up. I'm the counter soul, I've been just right now, I'm dredging up all this like really like otherworldly stuff.
Mhm.
And it's, yeah, I think maybe it's an ecology, but it's not necessarily how I'm thinking of it right now.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. I yeah, it's so interesting. It's funny you mentioned Stephen Goodman because he told me the opposite thing
Oh.
when I was talking to him. The great late Stephen, Tibetan Buddhist, and sort of introduced me to shamanism. Was pretty much directly responsible for the reason I went and like lived in Tibet for a while. Yeah, he was. We were talking, and I was like, "Hey, so Stephen, this is kind of how I see the world and where I want to go." And he's like, you want to be a Ronin, which I think was his way of saying interested in tradition enough.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah. He was so insightful, and he always knew exactly what to say.
yeah, yeah. This is a great,
Yeah.
great figure.
Yeah. So, let's move on a little bit
Yeah.
and look at your Continua work.
Mhm.
And the first thing I want to do is ask you, well, what is it?
So yeah, this works with. So it's I'm working with people, right? So a dissertation, you're kind of in your own head. You're just like, I have this thing I want to say. I want to articulate it in a way that doesn't sound batshit crazy, and that's kind of pure research, right? Especially sort of theoretical research. So that was academia. There was this important intermediate step. I don't know how necessary it was, but it was important. Before I founded the Continua Work, is I went back to school and I became a massage therapist. I was holding space in ceremonies for people and was flying by the seat of my pants. I'm still flying by the seat of my pants. But I was thinking, I need to really get anchored. And I need a tradition, right? That's what I was like. I need a tradition. And I think I'm a little bit allergic to having other systems stuck into my head. Um, probably too, probably maybe a little too phobic. But anyway, I was like, I want an embodied practice. So I really thought about this a lot. I was like, I remember pacing around my dining room table for weeks on end, thinking, like if I don't go into academia, what am I going to do? And massage therapy was perfect. It kind of came on me really suddenly that I wanted to do it, but it took me a while to accept that. Okay, I'm going back to school again after all this time in my doctoral years, and it was so embodied. So working as an embodied healer. So that was the first time I was like yeah, like you are working on people and they're coming back to you and they're saying, wow, you really helped me a lot. My work as a body worker was completely informed by all of this my doctoral research that we've been talking about. And little by little took these little steps to forming this body of work that I could teach people, and that became the Continua Work. So what do we do in the Continua Work? We basically teach people to cultivate a relationship with allies in order to help the world. There's a basic technique of healing. So and it's a hands-on healing technique, healing in conjunction with the allies. But a lot of it is just building. It's trying to make yourself as clear and clean, grounded, centered, transparent, embodied as possible, and instead of bringing these spiritual powers in kind of a dissociated way or maybe an inflated way, to really just these basic practices that we teach. There is a cosmology that really anchors everything. Anytime we're teaching anything, it's always anchored in this cosmology. The cosmology is sort of an unpacking of this mandala, using the word loosely, but a structure. The structure we use in the word, I call it the super core. This was disclosed to me in a non-ordinary state of consciousness. It really came through as this community of allies that come forward, and they have it's pretty intricate the way they come together. And I think students of Western esotericism, of Eastern traditions would be like, oh yeah, like that's a mandala. It's actually kind of like a Jungian quaternity, kind of, and that sort of there's a developmental cycle that just keeps going around and around, but it also has like this spatial dimension, and it's reaching back into our ancestral history, our biological history, our spiritually active biological history, back into these morphic fields, to bring forward these allies and sort of live with them in our lives in a way where there's not this disjunction, to really, like I was saying, to bring it forward, like we're the tip of the spear, we're this node that's aggregating, this wondrous node that's coming forward into the world at this time to participate in the world. And our egoic individuality and all its grubbiness is this, it's the diamond really at the tip of the spear that's pushing in. The allies, my sense, my experience of the allies, they're cheering for us. They love that we're in the world. They want to come forward. They love that they're participating in us. And the more we love that they're participating in us, the better. They're coming forward. And these are powerful forces. So there are certain practices and protocols to keep yourself anchored and not be blown out of the water. But when you realize how they work together, how they play off of each other, you can become a more effective healer, or just a more effective human being.
With working with the allies, I mean, you're giving people this training, and I'm thinking of one of my former roommates who's a very close friend of mine. And she's actually a massage therapist too. She really opened my eyes to the value of massage and how healing it can be. And I think it's so important. And this is something I think that's really close to you of, we have bodies. We can't just be focused on getting out of our bodies. Our embodiedness is crucial and important. But the question I'm trying to think of is, she is the language that she uses is her spirit guides, that she's trying to get in touch with her spirit guides and listen to them. So in this work that you're doing, are you helping people to be able to tap into that at any moment? Is it something that can help guide them on a daily basis? Can they receive messages just, like driving in their car?
Yes. Yeah. So it's seamless. Yes. In your ordinary life. There is this way in which the Continua Work, it is kind of just this this idea of it's involutionary in the way of like Sri Aurobindo thing of, there are these transcendent powers, and we're bringing them into our ordinary world through the collective human psyche, or in the Jungian sense, like bringing the contents of the unconscious into the conscious. So that is it. There are techniques, there are approaches, lineages where it's like, hey, we need to find the game. We're hunting, like shaman. Go into your non-ordinary state and tell us where the deer is, or somebody might be like, I'm playing the stock market and I need a little extra, that little juju. Tell me what I should put my money on. Or healers, hey, my grandmother she's in a very delicate state of health. I need you to get in there and intervene. So those sort of dramatic interventions often require kind of a movement into a more radical non-ordinary state, and that's a domain. That's a sort of a maybe outer band, or maybe far intermediate band of working with beings, where you go in there and there's a special condition. You go in there in a special state, and you create a very specific result in the world, and it can be for illumination too. It's like, okay, I need to see the greater reality, so I live my life more in alignment. It can be like that too. But what the continual work is, and what I think of, I don't think it's that unusual, is that it is purely seamless, and we're really trying to bring these energies in to our life, but without erasing the personal ego, without erasing our relationships. So the textures of life, I think there's something about the American mind, maybe the Anglo-Saxon mind, that is a little like, it's a little divorced from the textures of the world in a way. I tend to think of the Mediterranean psyche of being a little more like, hey, like yeah, we have all this like highfalutin stuff, but what's really important? Well, let's take a walk down to the cafe by the seaside, and drink some wine, and have good conversations with our friends, right? Like that's the spiritual place right there. So when I'm sort of activating my soul, or the souls of my body, or bringing my allies in a way where they're here, they're not erasing that. It's a bit of it's a practice too, right? You get this expanded awareness, and you're like, this is all bullshit, and you are all doing everything wrong, and I'm going to now tell you how to do it. Like, that happens so often in so many like subtle ways. The vaccine debate right now, like on both sides, people getting possessed by these complexes and being like, I know this is right, and I'm going to tell you how it is. And it's like, where have I seen this before? like, oh yeah, in the ceremony where the person had drank a large cup of psychedelic medicine. Very similar. Interesting. So that's where these powers can come in, but there are ways we can modulate it. And a lot about it is just cultivating heart, right? Cultivating and breaking down sort of that distinction of like my ordinary mind, my non-ordinary reality. But it's sort of this idea of pendulating. You kind of like go here, and then they start to merge these two states, and then they form like a stream. So I've had great results so far. I am a big believer in the effectiveness of, you can bring through the magical wonder, the enchantment, the powers of goodness, right? Like of humility and generosity. The Continua Work, the super core, this kind of mandala, that there are these virtues that we're constantly developing, but we don't just focus on like these transcendent, like higher chakra virtues. We're cultivating all the chakras of the body, and then even like, it's not even a vertical axis. It's all over. It's a messy, it's not even a sphere, it's just messy. This entanglement, and all this entanglement of virtues, we're trying to cultivate all of that. So that's where it is. And more the work I'm working on, and I'm moving into, I'm moving into middle age, I guess you would call it. And, your priorities start to shift. New allies come through in middle age and start to awaken and want to play. And those are the allies that are like, hey, like you only have so much time left, and let's kind of be realistic. And what kind of legacy do you want to leave? And it's less about, I want all my books to be read, 1,000 years in the future from now. It's more like, hey, I just like to be maybe remembered as a guy who helped people out. And if people don't even remember that, maybe I did, help people out in this world, and maybe not just my tribe, but all the tribes, and maybe not just all the tribes, but all the species. How can I just like leave a humble imprint on the world? So that's sort of the sweet spot, is tapping into these awesome, just exciting, incredible intelligences that we don't normally experience in our culture, in our ordinary state of mind. Tapping into that, playing in those just gorgeous waters, just incandescent with wonder and enchantment, and bringing that through in a way, living that, expressing that in a way that's the most humble, tender, it's almost discreet. Like it's just very subtle. It's very like, it's very like, ooh, just bringing it through. It's very, ooh, I just love it.
I love that very much too, and appreciate what you just said. I'm a huge advocate for virtues, but also I really appreciate this idea of the the stream, you know, that you've mentioned a few times, because it seems to me that, and I think this is what you were getting at a bit, people need to recognize that what they don't know.
Yeah.
And you know, we get so caught up in these systems of belief and ideologies, and you know, we tend to think that we have access to absolute truth while everyone else's truth is subjective, and forget that our truth is also subjective from the other
Yeah.
person's point of
Yeah.
view. And I think that being able to maneuver through uncertainties
Yeah.
and to get comfortable with the flow is crucial for our current moment,
Hmm. Hmm.
because we're just surrounded with uncertainties.
Absolutely. Absolutely. That's a lot of the work I do in the non-RNA state is exactly that. Just breathe it, like be aware of the uncertainty and don't freak out. I just say, oh, okay, this is good. This is good. And it's like, wow, that was actually easier than I thought it was. It's like there's this kind of like this very contracted part of the mind. It's like, I gotta know everything. I gotta know everything. I'm really losing it. And it's like that actually isn't a very strong part for most of us. That's really not a very strong part of the mind. And you relax that, and little by little exercising that muscle, and eventually you're like, wow, I'm okay with this uncertainty very much in these uncertain times, right? That I think that's kind of it. It's so much is changing, and we're afraid. And I think hand in hand with that, Nick, I really get to this place. One of the allies I work with, it's very close to me. Um, she's always saying, like, "What are you so afraid of? Like, what are you so afraid of? Like, why is everyone so afraid?" And it, I want to acknowledge, we're going through some tumultuous times, and we've been in at least the United States in the 20th, 21st century. If you're not in a terribly marginalized place. We've had a pretty secure life, and we could kind of count on certain things, and those are being taken away from us, and we're like, whoa, now we're living like the way the rest of the world is living, or the way most people lived in history, and I want to honor that. I want to honor that creates anxiety. Yeah, and let's really be present and bow to that particular initiation that we're going through. But once we do breathe through it, it's kind of like we're more afraid than we need to be. Climate change is coming at us full on, is going to completely change this planet. The science, the beautiful science tells us that it's the carbon's cooked into the atmosphere. Things are not looking great, and it's really kind of too late to totally go back to where we were. But that's not something we need to freak out about. Bow to all the species that are being wiped off the face of this planet and will never exist, as far as we know, on this planet ever again. Bow to all the people being displaced from their homes in climate catastrophe. But also it's like, what are like the fear doesn't help. Caution, discernment, awareness, empathy, yes. Let's cultivate more of that. Let's not look away. Let's not be Pollyanna about it. Let's take a close look to the extent that we can, hold that uncertainty. But like, wow, it's there is going to be a lot of turbulence, but it's not necessarily going to be bad, even in the near term. I know I'm going kind of on a limb there, but even in the near term, there's going to be so much joy in little pockets. I'll say that a little more with a little more confidence in like the midterm or long term. But yeah, it's there.
I had an experience the other night that left me with the feeling that it's all going to be okay. And I love me a good apocalypse, and I understand I often refer to it as the fear, and capital F, the fear. I can be pretty pessimistic, but I don't know. It just hit me on Friday that it's going to be okay. I think that maybe that is a product of learning to maneuver through all of these uncertainties and setting aside, not abandoning the ego, because I think the fears that people are experiencing is manifested through the ego in many ways. But learning to, as you've been saying, to humble the ego a little bit. That's what's going to get us through all of this.
Yeah.
My understanding is you are currently working on a book. Is that correct? And I believe it is titled The Counter Soul, or is that a tentative title?
It feels right. It feels very right, my brother.
All right. I know it's a work in progress, but can you tell the audience anything about it?
Yeah. I'm very very excited about this particular project. I get these sort of fits and starts. I write and get red hot, and then I kind of lose it. Have to wait a while, and it comes back up. It's so I'm loving it right now. It's a very personal book, and I think that's why it's a little harder to write, because it is about the counter soul. The counter soul is, everyone has a counter soul. So we're familiar with the way a soul incarnates, and I'm sort of this extension of this soul that I identify with. You are an extension of a soul that you identify with. But after decades of inquiry, I was like, there's another being there. And it's basically, if my soul is basically yang, or sort of a semi-quasi masculine valence, there's this female quasi kind of yin valence that has incarnated with me, not fully, obviously not physically incarnate, but it's there with me, these two unique beings. And you would have a counter soul as well. And you would be these two unique beings that are sort of spinning, it feels like kind of like a helix, like you're sort of spinning around each other, never quite totally merging, but you're playing off of each other and have these very different gifts. And the soul, the counter soul, but also like the ego is kind of in there too. It's just, I just love it. Basically, described by another name, this is the encounter with the Anima Complex. The contrasexual. I'm male, so the contrasexual female in my case would be the Anima figure. I see the Anima and the Dakini figure from Eastern psychology to be kind of different valences of the same counter soul being. So I'm diving into it. It has a lot of, in some ways, it's a very long love letter, basically, to my counter soul. And it's just very, there's a lot of eroticism in it. There's a lot of just basic biography. I'm looking at different phases of my life, and just like the kind of meandering. It's a very vulnerable thing to write. And fortunately, so I'm not caught totally in that vulnerability. There's a lot of these non-ordinary experiences where I'm working with this counter soul and looking at sort of, it's an excavation of her history and where she came from, and it fits together very nicely in a way that I'm like, like there's something there. There's a unified pattern. But that's what it is. It's kind of this devotional kind of like my inner goddess. The Dakini figure, the Tibetan traditions, have this idea of the Haruka and the Dakini, and it's lovely for sort of in our society for a man to just be like I love this feminine so much, and to bring it in this very very sweet, tender. It's a kind of a romantic adventure, is what it is. But it's not just when I'm on, it's when everyone's on.
Well, I look forward to reading it, and when it's done, I'll have to have you back on, if not have you back on before.
Yeah. Love that, Nick. Love that.
So where can people find out more about you and your work?
I have a website. It is www.thecontinuawork.org. That actually takes you to my massage therapy business, but there's a little link down there where it says something like learn more about the Continua Work or something like that. So you just click through to that. I'm kind of like, it's become a little more, now I sort of entered this phase of my life where it's a little more like, ooh, it's kind of hidden in the background. So that felt kind of appropriate. But yeah, that's a great way to go learn more about it. There's a lot of information there.
Okay, I will post the link in the show notes and in the video description on YouTube.
That would be great. Also, I want to point out too that I don't have a course scheduled right now, but I teach the Continua Work in courses. My last course was fully online with some senior practitioners. It was fantastic. Just really just got to didn't have to hold back much. But then I also teach more sort of more general interest courses. We don't do quite as much a deep dive. Typically, I'm teaching these courses in person, but because of the pandemic, switched to an online format, which I actually really enjoyed the online format as well. So that's another way you could go to the website and learn about that.
Okay, wonderful. Well, Alex, thank you so much for being with me today. I really appreciated your time in this conversation. And as I said, I'll have to ask you to come back sometime in the very near future.
Thank you so much, Nick. An absolute pleasure to have this conversation with you. It's just so it's an absolute delight just to be able to talk about this stuff that is so that I think we're both really passionate about. But also, I want to say it's a privilege too. Anytime someone gives you their attention, there's a magical act there. It's kind of a bit of life force you're bringing forward and being like, hey, like I want to hear your ideas. I want to receive your ideas. I want to be in dialogue with your ideas or your medicine. Right. So thank you again, Nick. A deep honor to be on your show. I'm a big fan.
Okay, well, thank you so much for that, Alex.
And that's a wrap on episode 13 of Rebel Spirit Radio. Thank you so much for listening or viewing for my YouTube audience. I did want to make one clarification. When I mentioned having read a book on green hermeticism by John Michael Greer, the actual title of the book I read was The Mystery Teachings of the Living Earth, which I highly recommend for anyone who's interested in looking at the Hermetic or Western esoteric and magical traditions and the natural world. In fact, anyone who's interested in Western Hermeticism or the occult or magical traditions can't go wrong by looking at the works of John Michael Greer. If you enjoyed this podcast, please make sure to give it a positive review on whatever platform you use to listen to podcasts. Your reviews really do help. And please consider subscribing. For those viewing on YouTube, please give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. Also, make sure you hit that notification bell so you will be informed when I upload new content. For the time being, I'll be releasing episodes every other week with the goal of releasing them every week in the near future. I'm also working on creating additional video content for the YouTube channel, including book reviews, educational videos on topics concerning spirituality, the history of religion, and the religious response to the climate crisis. If you would like to support my work in creating free and credible material on YouTube, please consider making a one-time donation via PayPal. You can find the link in the video description or show notes. Your support makes this podcast possible. I'm Nick Mather, and you've been listening to Rebel Spirit Radio. Until next time, may you be in peace, may you flourish in all possible ways, and may you continue to nurture your rebel spirit.